Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Florecita Jose y Pepe Hijón wash processed Ecuador from Say Coffee. There's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And this coffee was the collaboration between fellow coffee YouTuber Brian Kwan and producer Pepe Hijón, as Brian recently took a trip down to Finca Soledad to record a couple of videos with Pepe. And while he was down there, he did assist in the processing of this coffee. And when I found out Say was going to be releasing this coffee, it immediately caught my interest, despite the fact that it is a Sidra coffee, as I haven't necessarily been the biggest fan of Sidra coffees over the last couple of years. But naturally, a lot of people also reached out to us asking whether or not we were going to be reviewing this coffee. So I decided to pick it up, and it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 41. And one very important note in the name of transparency, I did happen to find a coffee bean sized rock within our bag of this coffee while we were working through it. Mistakes happen, it is unfortunate, but I did need to notate that within this review. Now, recipe we did opt for this coffee was Brian's Say recipe, which is an 18:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 100 degrees Celsius, about 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind, but we also went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, Say has been under a fair bit of scrutiny recently, having produced some of their coffees on a slightly more developed side of things. And while I haven't necessarily experienced that with too many of their coffees, there have been a couple that I have shared that sentiment towards. This one has been a lot more in line with a lot of the other experiences we've had with Say's coffees, which do still tend to remain on the lighter side of things relative to the majority of American coffee roasters. So I feel like that's usually the best place to align these coffees, and that's to kind of say that this one's on the moderately light side of things by most standards and expectations. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup is quite nice immediately off brew, as there was an above average level of sweetness for it being a Sidra coffee. There's a slightly candied floral feel to the cup that's reminiscent of what I would describe as bang honey, but otherwise it's pretty citric forward with a notable bit of the Sidra-like spiced feel to it. Day 17, we opted for the Chemex, and it was a pretty similar experience this time around, as it improved with a slightly more candied floral-like sweetness to it, as something I would describe as being reminiscent of Teddy Grahams. And it is kind of interesting. I've heard a fair bit of feedback on this coffee, but I feel like I'm the only one that really seemed to experience that in terms of the sweetness to it, as it is surprisingly sweet, and that's what this coffee continuously reminded me of, and it's something that we're going to continuously go back throughout this review. Cup is otherwise very Sidra-esque, as it continues to remain pretty nice with plenty of those herbal qualities to it. Day 20 opted for the April Brewer, and the cup itself is presenting in a much more spiced Sidra-like tone, as the listed mint does feel the most apt it has up to this point. It's much more present and prominent within the finish itself. Savory tea aspects also remain present in this one, with it continuing to offer that honey sweet like Teddy Grahams feel to it, providing a very nice level of sweetness to it. Day 23 opted for the V60 with Brian's Say recipe, and unsurprisingly, it definitely did seem to help with a lot of the more citric-like tones to it and the acidity in general, as the spice tones also felt notably more pronounced within this coffee. And I say unsurprisingly because I feel like Brian does seem to embrace a lot of the acidity in his coffees a fair bit more than I do. It's a preference thing, but given that his recipe was always going to kind of skew in that direction, it's unsurprising that that's the experience I had with this one. All of this did come at the cost of the honey-like sweetness, as I felt like that was a much more secondary and at times tertiary component to those more prominent, bright citric characteristics of this one. So it lends itself to an overall shift within this coffee, as a little bit more of those spice tones were also a little bit more prominent. Day 26 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this was the most unique the coffee had felt up to this point, as the sweeter honey components are still present, but even then they're notably more toned down relative to a much stronger spiced quality to this one. The listed mint did feel the most apt it had up to this point, with an added vegetal aspect and even more brightness, unsurprisingly yet again. So on day 29, we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee at this time really seems to lean into a lot of the green descriptors, as there's a pretty notable cooling effect that I would describe as being reminiscent of cucumber, and the listed mint to go with that citric tone. Still has a nice honeyed sweetness in the finish, giving it some depth, but that has been notably less pronounced than some of the earlier days. We move on to day 32 as we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it does seem to have slightly backtracked in terms of the sweetness as it's toned down relative to some of the earlier experiences with a much more prominent green tone to this coffee, and that once again is that lime kind of cucumber-like aspect, that mint-like aspect. There's a lot of green within this coffee. Spice is presented in a relatively refreshing sense, as this time I would describe it as being reminiscent of cucumber water. And on day 35, final notes, we do have opted for the V60 with Brian's Say recipe one more time, and there were some positives, and that's why we opted for this as our recipe, as it was reminiscent of some of our earlier experiences with this coffee, especially in terms of the brightness and citric intensity at the forefront. But this time it was paying off a lot more on the back end with a nice bit of Teddy Graham-like honey sweetness yet again. Less of the green herbal qualities were also present, and it is kind of interesting. A lot of the feedback I've heard up to this point has been that this coffee was super herbal, super green for a lot of other people, and for the majority of the time that I was working on this coffee, I didn't experience that as much as a lot of other people did. So it's something that I really wanted to notate, especially given that it didn't come out maybe as spiced, maybe as herbal as I might have expected, or a lot of what I'd heard back from others. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Unsurprisingly, of course, it is going to score there at that level 4. It is a wash processed coffee, and there isn't anything to really hinder that overall experience, especially given that a lot of the qualities in this one were pretty well defined, pretty well pronounced as well. So we'll just leave that there at the level 4 and kind of move on to the finish, also there at that level 4. And the finish is interesting because this one did have a fair bit of depth, and the finish came in a number of different directions. A lot of it was in that much more prominent spice tone, at times, again, that mint quality to this one as well. But in addition to that, a lot of the time I was experiencing this lingering sweetness that was in line with that Teddy Grahams, but a lot of the notes that we've discussed within this coffee were present within the finish at one point or another, whether it be that mint, whether it be that cucumber, whether it be that spice, whether it be that honey-like sweetness. So that one right there is scoring at the level 4. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense in that regard. Sweetness, level 4. And I mentioned pretty early on that it has that kind of interesting honeyed sweetness to it. And I'm not entirely sure what to make of that coffee or that description, once again, because nobody else has really mentioned anything along those lines. But for me, it was surprisingly sweet. Don't always experience that with Citra coffees in general, so it's something that was very important to notate within this one. Acidity, level 4, and I feel like that was certainly ramped up when we were adjusting this coffee to Brian's recipe, which does seem to accentuate a lot more of those acidic, brighter qualities to it. At other times, I would say that it could have actually scored at that level 3 mark, but given that that's where we opted to go with this coffee, I think it demonstrates how the tasting wheel can be skewed based off how you brew the coffee itself, so kind of important to notate in that regard. Citrus fruit, level 4, and I've barely mentioned that. Again, they have a lime note listed on here, but I'm so used to Citra coffees having those two things, spice and citrus, so it wasn't really surprising, and I don't think it was anything that was really worth discussing too much within this coffee itself, because obviously there was going to be a fair bit of citrus, and it was, I'd say, maybe one of the more consistent notes to this coffee, unsurprisingly. So that right there, lime, citrus, level 4, of course, it's where it's going to finish. We'll move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the florality, level 3. I don't recall them having any sort of floral note, but for me, again, it has that kind of floral honey tone to it. But the honey tone was a lot more candied as opposed to maybe floral. So that's the reason I kept it there at that level 3 to just kind of accentuate that part of this coffee. Spice, level 3. As mentioned, a lot of people were really experiencing a lot of those aspects, and it's probably the best place to put the mint right there with the savoriness both at that level 3 mark, because that's just kind of the best spot for it. Even then, I would say that it was a little less prominent for me the majority of the time, so I actually was fine with it being there at the level 3. I don't think it ever came close to the level 4 mark, where for a lot of people it was either at the level 4 or level 5 because it was just so prominent and pronounced for them. Savoriness, level 3, that's that kind of interesting, we'll say, green aspect that was very prominent and present within this coffee. In addition to that, they do have a white tea note listed on here. I can see some slightly savory tea qualities, but once again, this coffee really seemed to skew a lot more in the direction that I've mentioned, those classic citra qualities, spice, citrus, and then in addition to that, that honeyed sweetness. So a lot of the other aspects in this one were relatively toned down to those aspects. And I feel like the final thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel is the body at a level 2. So I was kind of intrigued by the overall result of that, as I think I can get pretty mixed experiences with Citra coffees, and this one didn't necessarily have the most amount of texture. I feel like it scored somewhere between that 2 and 3 mark, but even then it didn't necessarily have the most amount of body, so that's where we opted to put it. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my raw thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Going into it, as mentioned, it wasn't necessarily in line with my own preferences. I was really hoping that the collaboration they did was a Mejorado coffee, because then I would have been really excited about the prospect of how that coffee was going to turn out. When I did find out it was a Sidra coffee and I saw the notes that were listed on the coffee, I was like, I guess we'll see how this one turns out. But going into it, as a result, I had, I would say, pretty lukewarm, pretty moderate expectations. And that's why having this one turn out the way it did for me specifically was pleasant. And I would say it went above my own expectations. And that's why it's been so interesting hearing a lot of the feedback from people, because a lot of people have said that they've had a lot of difficulty with this coffee specifically. And I've also heard some positive feedback on it as well. But that's why it'd be very interesting to just get some additional feedback about how people felt on this coffee, given that there's been such mixed reviews overall for most people. But for me, I was really happy with the sweetness, and I wasn't expecting this much sweetness. So that in itself is a win for me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Given the nature of those very green qualities, I feel like you have to be able to live with those. And as I mentioned, I've had coffees that have much more of those spiced tones, spiced qualities to them. I've had coffees that have been way more minty, way more vegetal, way more just citrus in general. So for that reason, it didn't necessarily deter me too much as it might have deterred some people that aren't used to these sort of things in coffees. But if you're okay with those green tones, then that's a very good place to start. Outside of that, it does have some very consistent Sidra qualities, that of course being that spiced tone to it, that citrus tone to it. And once again, you're rewarded if you really like those aspects, because it does have some really nice sweetness to it that took me by surprise. So kind of put those together. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Florecita Jose y Pepe Hijon wash processed Ecuador from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.